and I work in an office. 9 till 5's not the best, I'll be honest. If I could change a single thing, I'd make it me and not him. He's in your bed, I'm in your Twitch chat. I've got the key and he's just a doormat. And even though he's got social skills, that doesn't mean I can't pay the bills. Anyway, make the most of him, 'cause she moves on pretty bloody quick. Oh, oh. Your new boyfriend's an asshole. Took you away from me, you hit it off instantly. I know, 'cause you won't stop telling me. I've seen his jawline, shoulders and muscles push against his fashion sense. I've thought about what he looks like nude. Not gay though. 'Cause she's living the dream. Oh, she's living the dream. From back when we were 17, she's living the dream. She's living the dream from back when we were 17. How on earth could I be safe when I'm one click away from insane? I just think that I deserve a little bit of what I earned. I'm not gonna make another scene. The one I made when I was 23 means I'm not allowed in Disney World. But he's in your bed and I'm in your Twitch chat. I've got the key and he's just a doormat. 'Cause even though he's got social skills, that doesn't mean I can't pay the bills. Anyway, make the most of him, 'cause she moves on pretty bloody quick. Oh, oh. Your new boyfriend's an asshole.
Hello! Back again with some more Passerine, eh? I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. I've heard people pronounce it as Passerine, but I read it as Passerine, and that just feels more natural, I suppose. Let me change the scene. There we go. Perfect. Alright. So, in case this is your first stream here, hello. The past few streams I've been reading a Minecraft YouTube or MCYT SBI or Sleepy Boys Incorporated fanfiction. It is comprised of Filza, Technoblade, Wilbur Soot, and Tommy Innit. The events of the past few streams, to summarize, Techno and Phil are immortal beings that killed a lot, I guess, in all of their years. And one day Phil left and made his own kingdom, and had children. And Techno stumbled upon it one day, and Phil asked him to help out with Wilbur, who was also hearing voices like Techno does. And one day the queen just died and Phil just left, making Wilbur king. Fast forward 9 years, Wilbur is king. Tommy finds out about Wilbur's voices, and there is a potential of a war. So yeah, that was the most I could summarize without going into full detail like I normally do. I'm not the best at summarizing. Got my water next to me. You know the drill. That's how I say it too. I'm excited. Been looking forward to these streams. Oh, thank you. It's very kind. So, let's get into this, shall we? So, the authors are Blue Jamas, BLUJAMAS, and THCSCUS. I just pronounce it as Thicksus. So all credit goes to them for this story. Whoop, that was my knee. Alright. Also, my accents may be a bit cringy. Leave me be. That's just how I get into character. The notes section says, chapters trigger/content warnings are as follows. Violence, depictions of violence, assault, death. Oh god, who dies? I swear if it's the one person I hear about that dies in this story, I will leave. I will end stream. I will. No, I won't. I won't actually do that. Unless they die at the very end, in which case I will end stream because I'm only reading chapter 4 because this is a long boy. Alright. Passerine, chapter 4. 3 men stood on a balcony where once there were 2. A mortal king, a mortal prince, and their red-eyed teacher. In the gardens below, travelers were gathering, most weary from their journey from every corner of the vast kingdom. Even now, more were still pouring into the capital city, staring in wide-eyed confusion, a conscription notice tucked into their pockets or crushed between nervous fingers. All able-bodied citizens of the kingdom are called to the king's castle, the letters all said, carried from bustling towns to quiet villages by messengers on the kingdom's most swift-footed horses, and courier birds taking to their familiar wind-carved routes. War is coming, and it is time to defend your motherland. The conscription letter had gone on to specify that only those over the age of 18 were to be included in the king's army. They had chosen to ignore that. Oh boy. Among the horde trickling slowly into the heart of the kingdom was a brown-haired boy a year shy of the stipulated age. Tubbo? Sorry, no. Probably not. He kept the hood of his battered cloak up, so no one could see the traces of boyhood still etched into his skin like a brand. Someone noticed. It was a girl with hair as pink as the hibiscuses she grew in her garden. Nikki? Sorry. She had lived in the city all her life. Once, a man with the same hibiscus pink hair had walked into her flower shop, his eyes bleak and unfocused. He'd ask her if she had any yellow roses for sale, and had bought it all. It was only later that she realized who the man was, but by then he had already left, heading towards the woods that bordered the city. Now, she marched along the city streets that had become unfamiliar over the course of a week. She left her garden to the care of an elderly neighbor. A sign was left on her flower shop door, telling hopeful customers that it was closed indefinitely. There was nothing else to do now but follow the course of the crowd, keeping an eye on a stranger that was definitely much younger than her, wondering whether or not he'd outlive her. Oh, that's deep. Or dark. The word is dark, not deep. They passed underneath the castle gates, where a woman they called the captain kept a watchful eye. Puffy? She was under orders to turn away anyone too young, too sick, too old, but every time she looked into their eyes, she only saw herself. She'd clawed her way to her position, made sure to earn her reputation, and had stood guard over the royal family for over a decade. It was her stubbornness that got her to where she was, adorned with medallions from the king, both old and new. It was stubbornness that she saw in these people now. So while she did her duty by barring the way for the youngest, the sickest, and the oldest, if she turned away for a moment when an aged warrior did her best to hide the wrinkles on the backs of her scarred hands, or when a 17-year-old boy pulled his hood lower over his face, or when a strong-jawed smith from the city limped by her with a broken foot that wasn't quite healed yet, well, she would consider that her duty too. By the time the boy and the flower shopkeeper found themselves in the garden, it was crowded. People stood shoulder to shoulder, pushing and pulling like a tide on the trampled remains of the dead queen's flowers. The shopkeeper grimaced as her boots treaded across petals and stems, violently returning them to their soil. The boy did not notice the flowers at all. That's interesting, B-boy. He was staring up at the balcony, looking at the man whose call was answered by thousands. I'm having a lot more of my own, commentary interjected in this than normal. What is up with me today? Most of them had never seen their king before, but they've all heard the stories of a boy crowned on the eve of his 16th birthday after his father's mysterious disappearance, or death, or assassination, depending on which rumors you believed, and guided by a strange advisor. A kingdom of peace would never have had any reason to know the name Technoblade, but those who heard the folk story of a red-eyed emperor from a cold and distant land whispered amongst themselves at the resemblance, or the coincidence, or whatever word they could use to explain away the uneasiness brewing in their gut. The stories also said that the king was kind and generous, with the starry-eyed ambition that came with his youth, and that the younger prince could charm 1,000 detractors with his wit and humor. Standing together, they seemed to be as different as night and day, one dark, one light. But no one could deny the shared brotherhood etched into their regal bearing, both products of a boyhood almost drowned in etiquette and decorum. The prince shifted closer to his brother. "That's a lot of people, Will," he murmured. The king's eyes were unreadable in the hazy light of the clouded afternoon. "Not enough," he replied. Their tutor crossed his arms as he surveyed the gathering crowd, already calculating battle positions and drafting strategies. This was, after all, not his first war, nor did he think it would be his last. "I'll oversee training as much as I can, for as long as we have time. I've identified some potential battalion leaders from the guards and the people who came earlier. I'll delegate the responsibility of training the newer recruits, which is most of them," Wilbur pointed out. I never had a reason to learn how to fight before this. You underestimate your people, Wilbur, Technoblade replied patiently. There are other reasons besides war. Look there. See that person with a bow? They're a hunter, used to shooting down fast-moving targets, which makes them an asset for our archery line. Folks from the mountain regions are used to riding on horseback, so that's our cavalry already established. Miners and smiths are used to swinging sharp and heavy objects around. Give them broadswords instead of pickaxes and hammers, and we'll be ready to go. Hold on one second. There's some gunk on my glasses, and it's bothering me. I'm seeing it through the screens. Is the music too quiet? Because I feel like I can barely hear it myself. In the meantime, if you guys are enjoying what you're seeing, be sure to leave a follow. It really helps me out, because I'm trying to at least get to affiliate. It would be nice to say that I reached affiliate while not even having a proper stream setup. Like, I don't even have a proper gaming chair, let alone an actual PC. I do all my streams on a laptop. It's kind of quiet? Okay. I will definitely turn up the volume. Just a tad. Is that better? I don't want it to be too loud, like last time. And once I'm done reading Passerine, I'll probably do other stuff, like the regular Minecraft and GeoGuessr streams. There's one stream I've been thinking of doing that I might turn into a video. That's the other thing. I want to upload to YouTube. I have a video ready to upload. However, I don't have the premium version of the editing software, so there's just this huge watermark, and I can't get rid of it. And I don't want to upload it without getting rid of the watermark. I could always just buy the premium or pro version or whatever they call it. But it's quite a bit of money. I mean, money I do have, but I want to buy Ranboo merch. I don't know. I'll figure something out. I also want to figure out a way to, like... I don't know how streamers are able to, like... You'd sub, though? Well, that's great. If you look up, like, I don't think I have any subscribers at the moment, but, if you want to be notified when I end up uploading that video, you can look up Claymation on YouTube and hit the subscribe button. Yeah, it's the same icon as my Twitch, and it probably says 0 subscribers. I just lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, I remembered what I was gonna say. I don't know how streamers, like, how they're able to, like, keep their alerts while going through, like, different, like, kinds of captures. Like, the only time that I can, like, see and hear alerts is when the actual overlay for it is visible. Not when I have, like, a regular window capture up or, like, game capture up. And I want to figure out how to make those alerts consistent, because I've been I've been researching it, and no answers have been given to me. See, all the professional streamer jokes that I make are just that, jokes. I am nowhere near professional because I do not have all my shit together. Back to the story. That was a bit of a tangent, wasn't it? Maybe dono and ask, or go on a Discord server and ask if anybody knows. That's a good idea. Might just do that. But I feel like if I I would probably feel less bad about it if I dono to like a smaller streamer, because if I were to like dono asking Ranboo or Tubbo or something, I would feel really bad that I would be bothering them. Because I feel like the answer to that question would be pretty lengthy, and I don't want to waste their time, you know? I'm just a nobody to them. Now, where were we in the story? Wilbur cut him a bemused look. You sound almost optimistic. Did you hit your head on a wall this morning? I've seen worse odds. Tommy scoffed. This is different from all your war books, Techno. This is real life. They seem open to answer those types of questions. Tommy always is enthusiastic about it, I don't know. I suppose. He did not notice the knowing look shared between his brother and their tutor. Wait, what? Oh, never mind. Anyway, Technoblade continued, I've reached out to mercenary guilds to supplement our offensive. Our coffers can handle the hit. After all, this kingdom has only been busy with trade for the decades. And if it all goes to shit anyway? Tommy asked quietly. Technoblade's expression hardened. It won't. How can you be so sure? Demanded the young prince. From what I've been hearing, we're nothing more than a bunch of poor saps armed with twigs against this... What do they call themselves? The Green Army. The Green Army, you say? Dream? Dweem? That finger thing? The one that actually means gay sex in ASL? Dweem? I should not have a following. Wilbur replied, not taking his eyes off the people below them. Ridiculous name, if you ask me, Technoblade said. Tommy did not laugh as he usually would. That message you received said they massacred an entire town, Wilbur, he choked out. An entire town, wiped out overnight like ants. Hold on, I feel a burp coming. And it's gone, never mind. Wilbur's hands tightened around the balcony railings, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed. They were taken by surprise. We will not be so unfortunate. None of them said the obvious, which was the fact that if Wilbur had not held his secrets so close to his chest, the town that once sat on their northern border might have survived. Wait, what? If Wilbur had not held his secrets so close to his chest, the town that once sat on their northern border might have survived. What? I'm trying to, figure out what this means. Sorry. Sometimes when I read something, I don't quite comprehend what it means 100% of the time. If Wilbur had not held... Let me try saying the opposite. If Wilbur held his secrets so close to his chest, the town that once sat on their northern border might have died. That's the opposite. So keeping the secret of the war. What? You know, I'm not gonna try. I'm not gonna try and figure this one sentence out. The fact that if Wilbur had not held his secret so close to his chest, the town that once sat on their northern border might have survived. They might have been warned. They would have been saved from their merciless doom. Oh, I think they're saying, I think the author's saying, if Wilbur hadn't kept it a secret. Wait, if Wilbur had kept it a secret, the town, wait, no. If Wilbur hadn't kept it a secret, they might have survived. Okay, now I'm starting to understand. Okay. Hypotheticals, Technoblade had told them before, were worthless, and only crippled their way forward. But it still sat in the uneasy silence between them, broken only by the tutor saying, "Other towns along the Green Army's route have been evacuated. We should be expecting refugees to arrive in the city in 3 days, but the temporary camps will be finished and ready by then." And what's the status on the army itself? Based on the spies' reports, we have half a month, at most, before they arrive at the valley, which gives us another week to prepare the troops before we set out. The armory should be done tallying and divvying up weapons by tomorrow, and caravans have been uploaded with other supplies. And the other thing we planned? Gathering the materials as we speak. The alchemists are working as fast as they can, given that it's delicate work. But it should be done before we go. Good. Wilbur raised his head towards the sun, breathing in the last sweet winds of spring. As he did, Tommy and Technoblade were the only ones to notice the fresh scratch marks running down the pale column of his throat. Tommy opened his mouth to speak, but was silenced by a quiet shake of Techno's head. I guess it's time. In one smooth motion, Technoblade jumped onto the balcony railings, balancing precariously like an acrobat on a tightrope, his beloved trident in his hand. He drove the butt of the trident against the railings, producing a sound like a bell tolling, over and over until the crowd was almost silent, their attention caught. "Your king," he shouted, "will now speak. I suggest you listen." He dropped back between Tommy and Wilbur, who gave him a grateful smile before turning back to their people, their army. "Friends," Wilbur began, his voice carrying out over the still crowd, now hanging on to his every word. "I see you all from where I stand. I understand you are afraid. You are confused. Years ago, I promised you peace on my father's crown, and now I call you to war. This is nothing less than treason. Rest assured, I will be facing consequences for it." The crowd stirred. Even Tommy looked to his brother in surprise, a question swiftly dying on his lips as Wilbur spoke on. "But that will be later," the king continued. "For now, we face an enemy that has mercilessly slaughtered our brethren on the northern border. That is what we shall keep in mind as we ready to face them. More than a battle to defend ourselves, this is a war of revenge. We shall remember the innocents lost to the nonsensical greed of our invaders, and I vow to deliver you your vengeance on a silver platter." Techno's eyes darkened, but he did not interrupt. His gaze drifted to the marble pavilion sitting in the distance, right where the crowd stopped. Its chests had been pilfered, the blunted training weapons melted down to make sharper, deadlier blades. The ivy tumbling from its roof swayed slightly in the wind, offering him a brief glimpse of the empty, dust-covered floor beyond. He wondered if he'd ever set foot in it again. The shopkeeper was the only one not watching the king as he spoke of bravery and keeping the faith. Instead, she followed the tutor's far-off gaze, but all she could see was a small white building, overgrown with weeds. "This will not be the end of our nation," the king said with a note of finality, his dark eyes sweeping across the gathered crowd, but not seeing their faces at all. He spread his arms, as if welcoming an embrace from someone no one else could see. "It has stood for centuries, and it will stand for centuries more. We will see our enemies burning, my friends, and I will scatter their ashes on the graves of the people they took from us. And anyone who survives the fire will wish they had perished in the flames, and not by my hands. My only hope is that you might feel the same, and trust that you are in the most capable hands I could find." He turned to the tutor. You are in the safekeeping and guidance of General Technoblade. Together, we will defend this kingdom, or die trying." Wait, didn't he say something similar on the Dream SMP? I wasn't there for the beginning, but I feel like I remember hearing a quote of Wilbur saying something like, "We will defend this country or die trying." I feel like I remember that. He did? Okay. The silence of the crowd gave way to thunderous applause, the exultant cry of hundreds of people who did not know, truly, what awaited them on the battlefield. The aged warrior with the scarred hands was intimately familiar with violence, and turned bitterly away from the excitement. She had been like them once, but no longer. They would learn, sooner or later, but it would not be a gentle lesson. However, they were united in some things. They trusted their young king and their prince. They trusted their general, and they wished to see their enemies burn. The boy in the crowd felt that unity down to his bones. This is it, he thought. This was what it meant to be a part of something, to belong. He felt a smile creep onto his face, and soon he was joining the noise, hollering until his lungs began to ache, joining in the people's furious glee. He was going to hold the line. He was going to drive the enemy back and protect the land that raised him. And he was going to be a hero. At 17 years old, Tubbo was the oldest he'd ever been. But he never felt so young. So it was Tubbo. Only one person did not seem impressed by the king's words. The tutor turned general was staring at the king, his mouth a thin line of disapproval. "Since when did I get the promotion?" Technoblade asked slowly. Wilbur shrugged, dismissive. "You're already acting like a general anyway. But Technoblade." The king's voice turned cold as he stared his old tutor down. "You promised to help me. Was that a lie?" Technoblade's eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful, Wilbur," he said quietly. "You're forgetting who you're talking to." Wilbur blinked, his eyes suddenly clearing. He opened his mouth for some sort of retort, perhaps an apology, but then there was Tommy. Brilliant, loud Tommy. Leaning so far over the railings, Technoblade had to pull him back by the back of his shirt. When he turned to them, he was beaming, his eyes bright in the afternoon gloom. "We're going to win," Tommy said, his ears still ringing with the crowd's approval. "We're actually going to win, aren't we?" Wilbur and Techno exchanged one glance. One glance, and all was forgiven. The conversation shelved for another day. The general still looked at the king with something close to concern, and the dark circles under the king's eyes were getting harder and harder to ignore each day. But none of that mattered anymore. If Tommy said they were going to win, then by gods, neither of them would tell him otherwise. Not when he looked the happiest he'd been in a month. By this time next month, we'll be back to worrying about trade routes and bothersome sycophants, Wilbur assured him. What the hell's a sycophant? Gods. The king gave his brother a look that was equal parts annoyed and adoring. Remind me to hire a better linguistics tutor for you when we get home. Tommy rolled his eyes. Good luck finding someone that can stand me. I'll chase anyone away in 3 days at most. Bet your whole damn life on it. Wilbur grinned at Technoblade. I can think of one person. Techno, will you finish that sentence? Technoblade drawled in his usual monotone manner. And I will end your blood right. I cannot speak. Hold on, let me just start again. Finish that sentence. Technoblade drawled in his usual monotone manner. And I will end your bloodline right on this balcony. I will throw you off, witnesses be damned. As the king and prince dissolved into laughter, for one shining moment, children again, Technoblade found himself smiling. The sky was dark and bleak, but there, on the balcony, there was sunlight. It's you and me, said Technoblade, putting one hand on top of Tommy's head, the other on Wilbur's shoulder. One more time. There's a little break in the chapter, so I'm going to take a sip of water. That was more of a gulp, but my throat's starting to get dry. The blue valley stretched before Tommy, disappearing into the hazy horizon. The 2 mountains that bordered the valley rose menacingly in front of him, twin endpoints of the imposing mountain ranges that served as the kingdom's natural borders. A river ran through the middle of the valley, lit into liquid gold by the sun slowly rising over the distant hills. All in all, Tommy thought as he breathed in the cold dawn air, this would not be the worst-looking place to die in. The valley was named after the blue irises that thrived in it, lining the cliff sides and blooming along the riverbanks. But they were not the flowers Tommy was in search for. He ventured down the hillside, keeping his eyes close to the ground. He had rolled up his pant legs to keep them dry from the morning dew that clung to the underbrush, but it left everything below his knees vulnerable to the traps that had been set around camp. One wrong move, and he'd lose a foot for his troubles. Excuse me. But he was determined to make the trip worth it. It had been a week since they had arrived at the valley, and while that meant most of the preparations were finished, it also meant that the other shoe would drop any day now. Tommy could feel it breathing down his neck. The only way to combat it was relentless distraction, keeping his hands busy. So he traveled down the hill, one careful step at a time, until a flash of yellow in his periphery caught his attention. "Found you," he said, making his way over to the flowers clustered under a rock, almost indistinguishable from their blue iris neighbors, if it weren't for the golden center that earned them their name. When Tommy strolled back into camp, he had a fistful of morning glories clutched in his hand and a grin on his face. Everybody was already awake, clustered around cook fires, going through morning exercises, or just milling about. Someone had brought their guitar, and its soft music echoed above the sounds of conversation and laughter. People raised their heads when Tommy passed, calling his name or waving him over to join them for breakfast. He cheerfully declined, but not before exchanging jokes and pleasantries with some of the more familiar folk. I just realized if Nikki has dialogue in this story, I do not know shit about a German accent, especially hers. This is gonna be hell. Alright. Right as I fucking say that, I see that she has dialogue. Are you... okay. Alright. It was easy to miss the shadows this way. In the right light, he might miss the tousled hair of those that had not slept in days. Just do a high pitch, true. Or the bleak look on the captain's face, quickly hidden by a strained smile. Or the smell of sulfur, demons? Sorry, that clung to their clothes like a nasty, unrelenting parasite. Sorry, I just see the words smell of sulfur and I get instantly sent back to my days of watching Supernatural. Alright, oh god, I've never tried sounding like Nikki before. Let me see. It's pretty tragic, isn't it? That sounded awful. Okay, just bear with me, alright? The question stopped Tommy dead in his tracks. He turned toward the person who'd asked, and found himself in front of a girl seated by a grindstone, slowly sharpening a small blade. Pardon? The girl smiled as she nodded towards the flowers in his hands. Morning glories. They wilt the same day that they bloom, lasting only until the sun sets. She paused. Maybe less, now that you've picked them. Tommy flushed with embarrassment, suddenly getting the urge to hide the bouquet behind his back, as if that might somehow erase what he did. I'm sorry. I didn't think about... The girl simply laughed. No, don't be. I would be the world's biggest hypocrite if I told you off for picking flowers. At Tommy's confused look, she explained, I own a flower shop. Back in the city. Oh! Tommy looked down at the flowers clutched in his hand, his brows furrowing at the thought. It is sad, I suppose, that they die so quickly. But aren't they beautiful while they last? The grindstone slowly ground to a halt as the girl merely sat there, staring at Tommy with an inexplicable expression on her face. Well, thought Tommy, this is awkward. You know, Your Highness, the girl said at length, you remind me of someone. He's a soldier in this camp, and about your age as well. He's off somewhere training right now. But I have this feeling that if you'd only meet, you'd make good friends. This is gonna hurt. This is gonna fucking hurt. Okay. Tommy opened his mouth to reply, but found he could only nod in agreement. The girl gave him a small, sad smile, as if she could understand his silence even more than if he had spoken, and went back to her work. Tommy pried his feet from the ground and began walking towards the heart of the camp, but the girl's words followed close on his heels. That was the true tragedy, wasn't it? More than the flowers that only bloomed for a day. The bitterest devastation was in the what-ifs. Tommy didn't understand why, but he found himself lingering one scenario. A different life where he had met that person that he reminded the girl of, where neither of them were young soldiers. You'd make good friends, she said, but that wasn't right. Tommy felt inexplicably, down to his bones, that if he'd met that boy, they would be brothers. Wow, the authors really know how to tug at the heartstrings, don't they? It was only until the royal tent was in view that Tommy realized he didn't even ask the girl for the boy's name. If we move the... Wait, who's speaking? Okay. If we move this battalion here, they could provide cover, but we would also run the risk of... Tommy? Tommy looked up. He hadn't even realized he'd entered the tent. He found Wilbur standing at the large desk that took up the most room, leaning over a map littered with small carved pieces that represented various troop positions. Beside him, his hair unbound, was Technoblade. Both were staring at Tommy with concern. "What?" he demanded. You're crying, Tommy," Wilbur said softly. Tommy touched his free hand to his cheek, and was surprised to find it come away wet. He rubbed furiously at his eyes until they were clear of tears. This was not the time. This was not the fucking time. He strode deeper into the tent, ignoring the worried look Wilbur threw Techno, and Techno's answering shrug. Tommy stopped at one corner of the map and pointed to a cluster of carved archers clustered on what would be the hill they were currently on. "We don't need that many," he said determinedly. "Just one. Just you, Wilbur." Wilbur seemed frustrated by the change of topic, but he had no choice other than to follow his little brother's lead. Wait, oh, that was Tommy that said that. Oops. Oh well. "You're overestimating my aim, Tommy." Tommy drifted away from the map, throwing himself on a spare chair in the corner. He gestured Techno over, and the general silently complied. "You always pull through when it matters," Tommy said as Techno took a seat on the ground in front of him, his back to Tommy. As Tommy gathered Technoblade's hair into his lap, he added, "Except the many, many times you lost a duel with Techno." Normally this would warrant a chuckle or, at the very least, an indignant eye roll, but Wilbur simply leaned over the map again, his expression shuddered once more. Techno turned to Tommy and whispered, "We must not break his intense, beast-like focus." Tommy snorted. The only beast-like thing about him is the tangled lion's mane he calls hair. Wilbur's head snapped up to glare at them both. "I heard that." "Of course you did," Techno said, turning back away. "Lions have an unparalleled sense of hearing." Tommy laughed quietly to himself as he began braiding Techno's hair, his fingers making knots with the ease that came with years of practice. This had been their routine for the past week. Wilbur would pore over the battle plans with wild-eyed obsession that got more and more frenzied by the day. Techno would call out every flaw in Wilbur's proposed changes until they encountered one that seemed to be actually useful, and Tommy would braid. It kept his hands busy. If it weren't for the distraction of Techno's hair between his fingers, Tommy would most likely join the flower shop girl over the grindstone, mindlessly polishing his spear until doomsday. Sometimes, Tommy would wake up in the middle of the night and find his brothers still awake, reviewing their plans and muttering to himself. Or not to himself. The voices. The mysterious, omniscient, creepy as all hell voices that had plagued his brother for years. Tommy began to weave the morning glories he'd found into Techno's hair, to hide the fact that his hands had started shaking. 2 nights before had been the worst of it. Tommy had been woken by the noise of glass shattering. Opening his eyes, he found Wilbur standing over his cot, a shard of broken glass clutched in his hand and raised over his head, ready to strike it into Tommy's chest. Oh fuck. Hold on. Alright, That's not very poggers of Wilbur. True. Tommy had stopped breathing completely. Will? He'd said, his voice coming out meek and trembling. Hey, Gray. Reading chapter 4 of Passerine. Haven't missed... Were you? I can't remember. Were you here for the last stream? Actually, no. I think I gave you a little summary of what happened. I haven't really missed much. They're just preparing for war. Oh! And I found out that, so the army that they're going to war against is called the Green Army. I bet you can guess who's in the Green Army. I mean, Peekaboo once more Twitch crashed. Well, I mean, we don't know who's in the Green Army, but I would assume it's the Dream Team. Wait, but it said in the beginning of the story that there's like a god that they call the Green Man. I don't know, maybe he's the leader of that army. But yeah, and 2 other characters have been introduced. Tubbo, a 17-year-old boy that somehow managed to slip past the 18-year-old age minimum. Like, there's a minimum, you have to be like 18 minimum to join the army, but he somehow slipped past the 17. And Nikki, I would assume it's Nikki because they described her as having pink hair. A flower shop owner that joined the army. That's about it. Right now, we're in a flashback to a couple nights before when Wilbur was standing over Tommy with a shard of glass in his hand. What do you mean, so he just lied? Oh, I don't think he said anything. I think the captain just turned a blind eye. I also think that the captain that they mentioned is Captain Puffy. I'm not too sure, but I'd like to believe it's Captain Puffy. Let's see. Okay, so I'll just start from the middle of this paragraph. Opening his eyes, he found Wilbur standing over his cot, a shard of broken glass clutched in his hand and raised over his head, ready to strike it into Tommy's chest. Tommy had stopped breathing completely. Will? He'd said, his voice coming out meek and trembling. What meant to kill you? Wilbur had croaked, blood dripping down his arm from how tightly he was holding the broken glass. We're going to kill you, Tommy. It's fate. It's meant to be. Wilbur. Tommy had reached out to clutch at his brother's shirt. Wilby, please, don't hurt me. Wilbur had blinked rapidly, his eyelashes glistening with unshed tears. You haven't called me that in such a long time. And the glass shard had dropped, but not into Tommy's flesh, into the ground beside his cot, driven into the soft dirt. Wilbur had kneeled beside him for the rest of the night, whispering apologies that chased Tommy into his uneasy sleep. By morning, Wilbur seemed to have completely forgotten the incident, or chosen to ignore it completely, and Tommy was already plucking flowers off the hillside with shaky fingers. Tommy looked up now to find a white cloth tied around Wilbur's left hand, where the glass had cut into his skin. It was the only evidence that that night had not been a dream, and that Wilbur's voices were slowly taking over. It must be the stress, Tommy thought, as he braided the last of the morning glories into Techno's hair, When the war was over, Wilbur would be back to normal again, and Tommy could go back to not being absolutely terrified of his older brother. Done, Tommy said at last, flicking Techno's finished braid over Techno's shoulder. Finally! Techno stood and plucked one of the morning glories off his hair. He tucked it behind Tommy's ear before moving over to one of the chests tucked under the table. Consider this as a sign of my gratitude. He opened the chest and pulled out something dark and folded. When he unfurled it, Tommy shot to his feet, his eyes going wide at the blue and red coat Techno held up, its golden buttons gleaming. The royal coat of arms stitched over where Tommy's heart would be. God, it's like the lmao skin! Ow! Why did I do that? They finished it! Tommy couldn't help the laugh that bubbled out of him. They actually finished it! Gods, Tommy, Techno said with a small smile. It's just a uniform. But it wasn't just that, and Techno knew it. He and Wilbur had received their own uniforms weeks before, the general and the king in their bold colors. In the chaos of preparation, no one had noticed the prince following in their wake in a simple white tunic until the very last minute. And now the tailors had done it. Every time you knocked, Twitch said, "We buffer now. Sorry. I won't do it again. I'll just do it on the chair." I hope that was better. Where was I? Oh yeah. And now the tailors had done it. They'd actually finished it. Tommy bounded up to Techno, grinning so hard he thought his cheeks might split from pure glee. Techno rolled his eyes, but held out the coat for Tommy to slip into. It fit. Perfectly. Tommy spun in a small circle before giving Techno a mocking bow. "Sir General?" Techno returned the gesture. "Your Highness?" "You two," Wilbur said, and Tommy could hear the smile in his voice, however faint, "are so stupid." Tommy waltzed over to his brother, knocking the carved piece that Wilbur was about to put down on the map. Over the sound of Wilbur's protests, Tommy grabbed his hands and pulled him along, humming a vaguely familiar tune, spinning him in slow circles that could be called a dance under the loosest of definitions. Wilbur went slack as Tommy continued to hum the song, allowing Tommy to spin him more and more. "I can't believe you still remember that," Wilbur said softly, his expression unfathomable. "Remember what?" "That song." And then they heard it. The sound that turned Tommy's blood cold. The sound that made Tommy and Wilbur freeze in their tracks. The sound that made Techno reach instinctively towards both of them. The drums of war, echoing over camp, eclipsing the music of a guitar, the conversations of friends, the screeching of a blade against grindstone, the thud, thud, thud of a 17-year-old soldier practicing his archery against a dark oak tree, the thud, thud, thud of the army's collective heartbeat, the thud, thud, thud of 1,000 feet marching closer and closer. The enemy had arrived at the Blue Valley. I just realized it's called Blue Valley. Have some blue. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. We're not even halfway done with this chapter. This is a long boy. Ow, my fucking palm. Hold on, I need a moment. Alright, I think I'm good. They emerged from the mist like specters, the hazy sunlight glinting off their polished blades. Up on the hill, Techno could see them moving through the valley in a steady stream, the soldiers indistinguishable in their tight formation. At the front, someone bore their flag. 2 swords crossed on a simple green background. The sight of it made Techno ball up his fists with a sudden, unidentifiable anger. This was it. It seemed like the entirety of the Green Army was here, as expected. While the valley would serve as a choke point in the Royal Army's favor, it was also the only direct path towards the heart of the kingdom. So now both sides were going to throw all their pieces on the board. One decisive battle, a quick end. Only one army would emerge from this valley intact, and Techno would be damned if it wasn't Wilbur's. Techno turned to the king standing beside him. "Are you ready?" Wilbur's eyes looked on the mountains. "Ready as I'll ever be." The camp behind them was empty. Everyone was in position, moving like clockwork under orders that they'd been practicing for days. The only ones left on the hill were Wilbur, Tommy, and Techno. And the archers. Tommy bounded up to them, his chest heaving with effort. "They sent up the flame," he announced breathlessly. "It's go time." Wilbur turned towards the group of archers behind him. Between them was a raging campfire, sending flickering shadows over Wilbur's face as he took one arrow from his quiver and dipped its cloth-covered point into the flames. The dozen archers, the best of the best, handpicked by Wilbur himself, copied him wordlessly. The cloth, smothered in a special incendiary fuel, would burn faithfully until it reached its mark. Wilbur turned back towards the valley, knocking the arrow into his bow. With a deep breath, he pulled the arrow back and aimed towards the sky. Behind him, the archers did the same. "Hold," he ordered. The Green Army marched closer. "Hold." Techno felt a hand close around his, nails digging into his palm, and looked down to find Tommy staring intently at the encroaching forces, his eyes unblinking. They were close enough now that Techno could see the glare of the dawning sun bouncing off their breastplates. Wordlessly, Techno squeezed Tommy's hand. "Now," Techno thought. "It has to be now." At the same time, Wilbur called out, "Fire!" 12 burning arrows arched out over the valley like comets of red and gold. The Green Army paused, perhaps in confusion at the pathetic display of force. Just 13 arrows. Did I say 1,001? I meant 12. Just 13 arrows soaring across the air. It would not even hit their front lines. But that didn't matter. They were not the intended target. Once upon a time, Wilbur's aim had been so poor, it would have taken nothing short of divine intervention to correct it. So Techno corrected it. Now, Wilbur shot true. His arrow landed amongst the weeds, and then there was fire. It felt like the whole valley was set ablaze, the heat searing Techno's skin even from where he stood. The burning arrows had ignited a line of fire that ran horizontally through the valley, cutting the Green Army off completely. Soldiers from the Royal Army had doused that area in the ever-burning fuel the moment they saw the enemy coming, and then promptly fell back into the mountains, taking shelter for the next phase. The fire would not hold them off forever. Wilbur gave a signal, Wait, Ayo, why would Wilbur let Tommy participate in the war? You'd think he'd make Tommy stay at home, though Tommy would probably sneak out. That's true. That's true. Wilbur gave a signal, and the archers scattered to their next positions, leaving the three of them truly alone, watching the wall of fire for the first signs of life. It came in the form of a man in a white cloak, stepping through the flames like it was merely an inconvenience. He shrugged off the heat, flicking an ember off his shoulder before his eyes found them on the hill. He pointed his sword straight at Wilbur. "That isn't a white flag of surrender, Techno," Wilbur said quietly. "No, it is not," Techno replied, finally letting go of Tommy's hand and reaching... What? Oh, and reaching for his trident. It was a long shot anyway. A little heat is nothing to mass murderers. "You should know," his voices purred. "This is not the time for your sass," Techno thought back, as if that might stop the age-old melody that was starting to play in his head. The rest of the enemy army followed after the man in white, less gracefully, but stubbornly, like God's damned cockroaches crawling over the valley. And then there was a battle cry, ringing from all directions as the royal army appeared from their hiding spots, in trees or in the weeds, from the river and from the mountains, and catching their enemy by surprise. But the Green Army was well trained. They recovered swiftly, and though most of their army was stuck behind the fire, they were biting back. It wasn't long until bodies were dropping, and not just the enemies. Techno's hand tightened around his trident as the valley filled with sounds of war, but it was not out of fear. Techno would never admit it out loud, but he could feel something, almost like excitement, pounding through his veins. This was familiar. This was something he knew, deep in his bones, he could do without failure. Being Wilbur's teacher, and then Tommy's, that had been terrifying. But this was nothing. This was just another battle to fight, just another war to win. "We need to help," Tommy said, his feet already moving down the hill. Wilbur's hand shot out, dragging Tommy backwards. Both Techno and Tommy looked at him in surprise, but Wilbur was looking past them, at the carnage happening right below their feet, his eyes dark as the earth of a freshly dug grave. "Wilbur?" Tommy asked in astonishment. Wilbur blinked rapidly, like he was coming out of a dream. "Not yet," he said quietly. "What do you mean, not yet?" Tommy demanded, pulling himself out of Wilbur's grip. "Our people are dying down there!" "Wilbur?" Techno spun Wilbur by the shoulders towards him. "We have to go. Now!" Wilbur took a rattling breath. "I know. God damn it, I know!" He glanced at Tommy, standing beside them with his face drawn in confusion. "But I can't let Tommy—" "Don't talk about me like I'm not fucking here!" Tommy spat angrily. "Wilbur, this is neither the time nor the place to Wilbur, this is neither the time nor place to underestimate me. We need to fucking go!" "Tommy," Wilbur said, staring at Tommy in shock. "I never underestimate you." "Then prove it! Let's go!" "You're right." Tired resignation colored Wilbur's words. "But stay close to me." He looked grimly back at Techno. "Don't lose yourself out there." Techno could hear the warning in his voice. "Take your own advice, Your Majesty," Techno replied sourly, taking in Wilbur's wide eyes and trembling hands. Hold on, I need some water. "I'm serious, Techno." Wilbur's expression hardened as he lowered his voice, speaking to Techno and Techno only while Tommy was distracted by fight below. "This is a direct order from your king. Keep them in check." "He thinks he can control you," the voices whispered. "He thinks he is your master. Will you prove him right, like the loyal little dog you are?" "I promise, Wilbur," Techno said. "After all, domesticated dogs," someone once said, "still fucking bite." "All right," Wilbur said, shouldering his bow with a look of determination. "Let's go to war, boys." The first time the captain killed someone, she was 15. He would have killed her. She had seen it in his eyes, lost to a drunken frenzy in a small, lonely tavern far from here. He'd come at her with heavy hands, and so she'd taken a bottle from one of the tables and broke it against the side of his head. And when that hadn't been enough to stop him, she'd shoved the sharp pieces clean into his throat. She'd ran from the tavern right after, ran from the town and didn't stop running until she reached the kingdom capital, where a king with mercy sewn into his smile had offered her a job, a home, and a life that ensured no man would ever dare cross her again. But even after all these years, the captain could still remember the feeling of skin giving away beneath the sharpness of her weapon. She could still see the man's face, contorting with pain and disbelief, barely able to process what was happening before the death throes took him. She could still hear him choking on his own blood, gurgling wetly before he was finally still. But there was a moment between the killing and the running where she merely sat beside the corpse of her own doing, numb and empty and cold. The soldiers this time would not be so lucky. She could see it in their faces, the ones who'd never seen a day of violence in their lives, making their first kills right in front of her. She could see some of them hesitate, panic, fall into the same abyss she did once before. Most shook themselves out of it, their brains shelving the damage for another day. But others stood frozen, caught in their own thoughts, until their comrades found them, or their enemies did. The captain could not help. She wanted to, more than anything, because wasn't that her job? Wasn't she meant to protect them? And then another enemy would come flying her way, and all she could think about was staying alive and surviving to the next hour, the next minute, the next breath. The Green Army had already begun to find ways through the wall of fire, and it wouldn't be long until the rest of them would arrive with a vengeance. The captain swung her gladius, deflecting the oncoming blow of an enemy before thrusting her blade deep into his chest. She did not look to see him fall. She was already moving across the battlefield, slicing her way towards a group of royal soldiers pinned between a rocky incline and half a dozen enemies. She took 2 down before the rest noticed her, and the captain found herself facing 4 people at once. Hold on. My neck is feeling a bit stiff. That's better. With a shield in one hand and her sword in the other, there was little the captain could do but face them down. This is it, she thought. This is my final stand. "You little shit," one of them spat at her. "You think you're so brave, all on your own?" They surged towards her, and the captain raised her shield instinctively for a blow that never came. When she looked again, she found all 4 soldiers dead on the ground, with a man in a red and blue coat and flowers in his hair standing over the still twitching bodies. Blood dripped down the prongs of his trident, too much to have come from just the 4 bodies. 4 throwing knives were already missing from the bandolier across his chest, and the expression on his face was cold enough to freeze hell. "Stop staring and get to work, soldier," Technoblade said. The very same Technoblade the captain had seen carrying the small prince on his shoulders around the castle. The same Technoblade that shuffled uncomfortably in too tight suits at formal functions that he nevertheless always saw through to the end. The same Technoblade that the past king, the captain's savior, entrusted with his sons. The captain could barely recognize him. But then again, something in the back of her mind told her that she was truly seeing him for the first time. She'd heard the rumors, the whispers, the questions about how he never seemed to change over the years. She disregarded all of that now. He was the man who just saved her life. Nothing else mattered in war. She saluted, "Sir, yes, sir!" With a curt nod, Technoblade was off. Merely a blur of color cutting a violent path across the valley, his trident flashing in the sunlight. A whimper caught the captain's attention, and she turned back to the royal soldiers that she had been trying to rescue. "Are you all right?" she asked them. One of them, a fresh recruit she did not recognize, blubbered, "Who the hell was that?" "That was your bloody general," she snapped. "So you can stop Hold on. My brain is working too fast for my mouth. "That was your bloody general," she snapped. "So you can stop cowering in your corner now. The blade has just joined the fight." The laughter was the worst of it. Wilbur could feel it growing louder in his head. The sound of 1,000 different voices laughing at a joke he was not privy to. A joke with him as the punchline. But then the still healing wound on his hand would ache, reminding him of what he'd done and where he was. He was standing on a rock, feet braced against moss, felling distant enemies with arrows. He was King Wilbur, protector of the realm, ruler of the kingdom, leader of the royal army, and he'd brought all these people here. And he was not going to let them down. He could spot Tommy's golden head below him, clearing out the enemies that slipped by Wilbur's shots. He was good. Frighteningly good. It was easy to forget how capable Tommy was at destruction. He was so used to seeing Tommy lose against Techno that he'd forgotten that against anyone else, Tommy was a force to be reckoned with all on his own. But that did not do much to dispel the worry tightening in Wilbur's gut. He was, after all, also an older brother. Tommy launched himself at an incoming enemy, spear out. The enemy swung with his sword, but Tommy ducked just in time and swept his leg out to knock the man over. Wilbur saw the spear pierce clean through, and the body was still twitching on the ground before Tommy was whirling around to face another. This one didn't even get a meter near Tommy before Wilbur had put an arrow through their throat. Tommy whirled around and flashed Wilbur a grin. "Not bad, Archer boy!" Despite everything, Wilbur managed a small smile. A smile that slipped from his face when a sudden motion flickered in the corner of his vision. "Tommy, watch out!" Wilbur shouted, just as the enemy soldier barreled into Tommy. The two of them tumbled into the dirt, a tangle of limbs and blades. Wilbur fumbled for an arrow and found his quiver empty. "Shit," he thought. "Shit," the voices agreed happily. Wilbur hurriedly slung his bow over his shoulder, and in the same breath unsheathed his twin rapiers from their scabbards. He dropped down from his perch, his teeth rattling on impact, the pain not registering because Tommy's in trouble. The enemy soldier had Tommy pinned to the ground, a sword raised over his head and ready to drop. Tommy was thrashing, desperately reaching for the spear that had been knocked out of his hand. But Wilbur was already kicking the enemy violently off him. The enemy rolled across the ground, allowing Wilbur to stand between him and Tommy, the twin swords flashing menacingly in the flickering firelight. Get the fuck away from my brother, he hissed. How touching, the soldier said mockingly. He was different from the others. Wilbur could tell. He didn't know how exactly, but he just was. His eyes and hair were as black as coal, in stark contrast to the blood-stained white cloak he wore around his shoulders. Oh, this must be Sapnap. You, Wilbur said, brows furrowing. I saw you walk through the fire. How? The man scoffed. You think that little stunt could hurt me? He raised his blade. Upon closer inspection, it looked to be made of pure obsidian, pitch black all the way down to the hilt. I was born in fire. Are you the leader of this army? Wilbur demanded. He gave a short bark of laughter. Me? No. I'm merely a pawn in this game. A pawn with a grudge to settle, but still a pawn nonetheless. He grinned. Now show me what he taught you, King. Wilbur didn't need to be told twice. He launched himself at the man, blue irises crunching beneath his feet. Their swords met, and from there it was a dance. Blades flashed as Wilbur began pushing the man backwards, but he was matching Wilbur hit for hit. Wilbur thrusted forward with his left sword, but the man dodged fluidly before swinging his sword in a mean arc that would have taken Wilbur's head clean off if he had not stepped backwards. From there, the man launched his offensive, striking from above, but Wilbur managed to cross his rapiers together and block the hit just in time. The blow reverberated down to Wilbur's bones, but the man gave him no time to recover, pushing his blade harder against Wilbur's. Wilbur dug his heel into the ground and parried, using the man's weight against him. He'd hoped it would cause the man to stumble and end this matter once and for all, but instead, the man swung again, feigning another overhead strike before changing to a side hit at the last moment. Wilbur blocked the blow, but the force of it sent him crashing to the ground. The white-cloaked soldier stood over him, a small smile playing on his lips. That was disappointing, he said, spinning his sword lazily between his fingers, as if he had all the time in the world. At the very least, I expected a man trained under a god of blood to, well, actually draw some. Wilbur froze. He glared up at the man standing before him, suddenly understanding. You're here for techno. The man stopped spinning his sword. I'm surprised he told you what he is. You must mean a lot to him. His smile was slow and cold. That makes this all the more fun. He raised his sword and brought it crashing down. It might have been hours. It might have been days. It might even have been between the space of one breath and another. Technoblade could no longer tell. More and more of enemy were finding ways to breach the wall of fire. The Royal Army's archers were doing their best to snipe them down before they could join the fray, but their dreadful lack of experience was beginning to show. Cracks were forming. They were nearing a breaking point. No, Techno thought, trident in one hand, a bone-handled chain whip in the other. Not if I can help it. He found himself in the thick of it. Where was I? Drawn not to the violence, but to the sounds of Wilbur's people, his people, calling for help, a god's help. Blood, the voices demanded. Blood for the blood god. Yep, you said it, not me. But Techno didn't want blood. Not today. He wanted justice. Get down, he told the Royal Army soldiers that had gathered around him. Techno realized with a jolt that they had not come to him to ask for his protection, but to give him theirs, as if their fragile mortal bodies might make a difference when it came to him. Fools, he wanted to say, but all that came out was, "On the ground, all of you, now!" They were quick to comply. They dove into the weeds just as Techno lashed out with his whip. The heavy chain carved an arc through the air before finding its mark, wrapping around the neck of an enemy soldier. Techno pulled sharply, knocking the soldier down. He shook the whip free and spun it around to hit an incoming enemy straight in the head. Well, in the head. There was a sickening crunch as the force of the whip crushed bone. Before the body hit the ground, Techno spun the whip towards other targets, aiming for throats, temples, ankles, anything to pull or crush. He was standing in the eye of the storm, his whip cracking through the air like lightning. When the chain whip rattled back into his hands again, it was wet with blood. "You can get up now," he told the soldiers that were staring dazedly up at him from the ground. "Take care of the stragglers." "What stragglers?" one of them called out incredulously, but Techno was already moving again. He launched himself into the air, for a brief moment, flying weightlessly over the carnage, and then he crashed down with his trident, impaling a man to the earth. He pulled the trident out with a sickening squelch, and then threw a throwing knife into the eye of an approaching soldier. Another came running towards him, but he made quick work of them too. This was his element. This was where he belonged. "More," the voices demanded. "More, more, more!" This was not his element. This was not where he belonged. He was under strict orders from the king to keep himself in check, and he would not falter now. And then he heard it. Techno could not explain how he heard it over the sounds of swords clashing and people dying and fires burning. It was as if his very soul had only been listening for that sound, and nothing else. In the far distance, a scream. Oh man, I lost a follower. Fair enough. When he was a child, Tommy had tried to scale the side of the castle. He did not remember the fall, but he remembered the crash. He remembered the feeling of his bones splintering underneath him, the pain so blinding that he almost passed out. He didn't know who eventually found him, but he eventually woke up in his bedroom, his left arm in a sling and Wilbur asleep by his bedside. Techno had been leaning against the far wall, glaring at him. "He's been here for days," Techno had said. "You really scared the shit out of him, Tommy." It was the angriest Techno had ever been at him, and that was the moment Tommy understood that what he really meant was that Tommy scared the shit out of both of them. As the white-cloaked man's sword broke through the shaft of Tommy's spear and into Tommy's shoulder, he remembered that pain, and it felt it 1,000-fold. He felt the blade break through skin and embed itself in his collarbone, and there was only fire in his veins. "Tommy!" He felt Wilbur's hand pulling him back, and they both stumbled backwards, Tommy still clutching the broken ends of the spear he tried to shield Wilbur with. Tommy fell to his knees, the pain making everything go white. "I'm going to pass out," he thought. "I'm going to die." "Little hero," the man grumbled as he approached them once again, the edge of his sword dripping with Tommy's blood. "You're only delaying the inevitable. Now sit still as I put you down." "Tommy." Wilbur's hands were on him, pressing against his wound. Tommy, come here. I'll fix you. Wilbur." Tommy croaked as the white-cloaked man advanced. The enemy. Say your goodbyes, princeling. The man cackled, raising his sword one final time. Tommy grabbed Wilbur, even as his entire body trembled with the movement, covering his older brother's body with his own. He shut his eyes, waiting for the coup de grace. It never came. When Tommy looked back again, he found Technoblade standing over them, blocking the man's sword with his trident. Finally, the man growled, pushing against the shaft of Techno's trident. I've been waiting for you, you bloody bastard. Techno cocked his head to the side, considering the man at length. He said monotonously, don't fucking know you. The man's eyes hardened. You killed them. You took them both away from me, and you don't even remember. He jumped back, cutting the air between them with his sword, splattering the ground by Techno's feet with Tommy's blood. That's alright. I'll just make you remember. Techno turned to look at Tommy and Wilbur, his expression carefully neutral. Excuse me. He took in Tommy's wound, Wilbur still frantically trying to suppress the blood flow. Techno, Tommy breathed. Techno's jaw clenched. Go. He turned back to his enemy, his braid whipping in the wind. Most of the morning glories were gone. Take care of your brother, Wilbur. What? Tommy, let's go, Wilbur said sharply. He began to pull Tommy over to the mossy rock he'd been standing on. He leaned Tommy against it and bent to the task of securing the gash in Tommy's shoulder. Wilbur ripped the end of his red and blue coat and began wrapping it around Tommy's shoulder. I can't see, Wilbur, Tommy protested, straining to look beyond Wilbur's head. You don't need to see that, Wilbur insisted grimly, tightening the cloth around the wound. You don't want to see that. See what? Tommy demanded, his throat aching. When had he started screaming? Wilbur, we need to help him! Before Wilbur could reply, there was a loud crack, like thunder, making them both flinch. Wilbur turned towards the sound, just enough for Tommy to catch a glimpse of the fighting over his shoulder. Just enough for him to see Technoblade raise the man up by his collar and drive him straight into the ground, shattering the earth once more. He was supposed to be dead. As Technoblade drove him against the dirt with enough force to crack it, he knew the man should have died the first time around. But he didn't. Instead, he merely grinned up at Technoblade with bloody teeth, his face drawn in cold, and, much to Techno's chagrin, completely earned arrogance. Ah, I see, Techno said with his hand around the man's throat. What's a god of war doing in a place like this? I would state the obvious, the man said calmly, gesturing to the bloodbath around them. But this is a purely personal affair. He kicked up, landing a hit on Techno's gut that launched him backwards. Techno braced himself against the dirt, unwilling to give the war god any more ground. Tommy and Wilbur were somewhere behind him, and that was all the reason Techno needed to pick up his trident again. The war god got unsteadily to his feet, then seemed to merely shake himself out of the experience of having his head cracked against the ground with the force of 20 rampaging bulls. He cracked the tension out of his neck and simply picked up his sword again. Now that we're properly acquainted, the war god said, let's take this more seriously, shall we? He moved quicker than Techno expected. Techno barely managed to parry a blow aimed directly at his heart. Techno thrust out with his trident in retaliation, but the war god simply danced out of the way before returning again in full force. Techno took one of the knives from his bandolier and stabbed out, managing to nick the other god, just barely, before they clashed weapons again. Blow for blow, hit for hit, they could have gone on like that for forever. A god of war and a god of blood. In another life, they might have been allies. Techno tried in vain to remember which of the many people he'd felled over the centuries. Which of the many people he'd befelled over the centuries had belonged to this man? But there were too many. A long line of ghosts he would spend the rest of his immortal life atoning for. Atoning? The voices laughed. What is there to atone for? Does a lion atone for killing the gazelle? Does the fire atone for burning? What's this Twitter notification? Oh, it's a... Carl. Hold on a second. My wrist just made a sick pop. Nice. Sorry, I gotta DM something real quick. Sorry, something I gotta do real quick. Wait, hold on. Sorry, just some, Wait, there was Ran Mail? Hold on a second. There's a lot of shit happening right now that is all over the place. Oh, I just had a moment of... What's the word? The word's not scurvy. It's like... feeling a bit woozy, actually. It was just for a moment, though. Okay, back to angsty, what's the word? Angsty story. This is futile, the war god said. Wait, did I miss a... I think I missed a paragraph. Techno jumped backwards and threw his... am I okay? I think so. Maybe I just need more water. Is something new playing? Actually, no, autoplay's not on. I'm good. Which the war god deflected easily with his sword. He threw another, which the war god dodged. Another, which stuck harmlessly into the earth. Techno reached for another, and found his bandolier empty. This is futile, the war god said. Just put down your weapons, and maybe, I'll give you the merciful death you never gave them. You fight and you struggle, but we both know how this ends. Mortals and their bloody games. There can only be one outcome, right? The war isn't over yet, Technoblade replied. The god of war smiled, his eyes drifting to something over Techno's shoulder. Are you sure about that? Techno looked behind him, his eyes finding Tommy and Wilbur first, crouched underneath a rock. Techno could not bring himself to linger on the look of fear on Tommy's face as he stared back at him, and so he continued searching the horizon for what had caught the war god's attention. His heart, what remained of it, sunk as he took in the thousands of enemy reinforcements flooding into the Blue Valley. Oh, God. Tubbo stood in the knee-depth waters of the river that cut through the valley. Once clear, it now ran red with blood. Friend or foe, it didn't seem to matter. They all bled the same. The river's current was tugging at him. It's all right, it seemed to say. You can let go now. And Tubbo wanted to. By gods, he wanted to, more than anything. His quiver was empty of arrows. He'd lost his bow and sword in the chaos. All he had now was a dagger. Its blade no longer than his hands, and just as frail. His body felt like it had been fighting for weeks, but a glance at the sun high overhead told him it had only been hours. Hours of senselessly slaughtering his way through the fray. It was better when he still had arrows, when he could stand and shoot at distant enemies without thinking of them as people. When he had resorted to using a sword, when he'd gotten close enough to see the fear in their eyes as his blade pierced through cloth and skin. When the blood had colored him crimson, it was suddenly, frighteningly real. Once, he had wanted to see their enemies burn. Huh? Excuse me? What the hell was that? Hello? Are we back? My OBS just disconnected. Are we... What is happening? Everything is so... Everything... Oh my god, the bit rate is... What's the word? You hear me, okay. The music, if you don't hear the music, that's because the music is paused. Okay, I think we're slowly getting back, Okay. Abysmal, that's the word. The bitrate was abysmal. Why am I hungry? It is almost 1 a.m. Okay. Let me just, replay this. Midnight snack is why. That's why you hungry. Yeah, I suppose. I'm used to having midnight snacks around this hour. Okay. Good to know I didn't lose all of my viewers. Jesus, what the fuck was that? Go eat something? No. Not until this chapter's done. Let's see. Where was I? Once, he had wanted to see their enemies burn. Wait, hold on. When... I don't know how it was, like, on your end. So I might just... do this. Hours of senselessly slaughtering his way through the fray. It was better when he still had arrows, when he could stand and shoot at distant enemies without thinking of them as people. When he had resorted to using a sword, when he'd gotten close enough to see the fear in their eyes as his blade pierced through cloth and skin, when the blood had colored him crimson, it was suddenly, frighteningly real. Once, he had wanted to see their enemies burn. Now, he just wanted it to be over. Tubbo looked up at the sound of shouting. For him, enemies were running through the wall of flames, cutting through the fire like one after the other in an unending tide. The words reinforcements and too many and retreat echoed in Tubbo's ears as the breath was knocked out of him. He tightened his grip on his dagger as the enemy reinforcements advanced, cutting down people who were too weak, too inexperienced, too tired to fight. People like Tubbo. They drew closer, an infinite army. Tubbo felt bile rise in his throat. Too many. Oh, did it like completely end the stream? Wait, actually, no, it says it didn't stop at all. I never clicked go live again. This better not be 2 VODs. He felt his fear and dread like a physical weight, almost driving him to his knees. Too many. In the end, Tubbo was not a hero, but he raised his dagger anyway. Is he fucking dead? We're here? Yeah, I know you guys are here. I was just wondering why it sent out a notification again. God damn it. Not Tubbo. And when I'm done reading this entire story, I gotta watch the saddest animation again now that I have everything in context. It's over, Tommy whispered. He leaned against his brother as they both looked over the valley, at the enemies descending upon their army like a swarm of hawks. The pain in his shoulder was now a distant worry. It wouldn't kill him, but he knew death was coming for him regardless. We're fucked. Wilbur was very still. Wilbur? Tommy turned to his brother. You know I love you, right? The king gave him a sharp look. What the hell are you talking about? Tommy swallowed thickly, trying and failing to keep the tears in. I love you. Don't think I ever said it, but it's true. I figured if it's my last chance. This is not your last chance, Wilbur snapped, his eyes darkening. He whirled around, facing Technoblade, who still stood between them and the mysterious soldier. Techno! Techno glanced back at Wilbur, his expression shuddered. He did not look at Tommy. It's time! Wilbur called out. For a moment, Techno only stared, and then slowly, deliberately, he nodded. I'm sorry, Wilbur. What? Tommy demanded. What are you two talking about? Wilbur did not reply. He wasn't even listening. Tommy could only watch as Wilbur unhooked a blowing horn from his side. He put it up to his lips mechanically, his eyes blank and staring at nothing at all. Wilbur? Tommy begged. Wilbur, what's going... Wilbur blew the horn. She heard it. They all did. Heads snapped up at the sound of a war horn echoing through the valley. A low, sad sound, like the beginnings of a funeral dirge, or the cry of a lone bird separated from its flock. The flower shopkeeper met the eyes of a woman across the field. A strange, only familiar from brief, inconsequential meetings at the camp. But in that moment, they were kindred spirits, united in their determination. Wait, what? The shopkeeper nodded. The woman gave her a solemn salute. It was now or never. The shopkeeper glanced at the oncoming horde of enemies, butchering all that stood in their way. But the royal army was not fighting anymore. No, they were running. They threw down their weapons and ran back in the direction of the hill, stumbling over weeds and irises and vines of morning glories. The Green Army, outnumbering them 10-1, gave chase, unaware of what was coming. The shopkeeper took off, the rock in her pocket seeming to grow heavier with every step. But unlike the others, she was headed north, up one of the craggy mountains that bordered the valley. She knew the others, at least those who weren't dead already, must be headed towards the other mountain, crashing through the trees and underbrush as she was. There were 50 of them in total, but only 2 of them were really needed for the job. If you lose heart, the king had said during the midnight meeting where he'd laid out his plans to the volunteers, just make sure someone else still has theirs. This is a last resort, but it might also be our only choice. He told them all they were free to leave. None of them had. The rest of camp had all been told 2 things. When you hear the horn, run for your life, and don't tell Prince Tommy. The shopkeeper bounded over boulders and overgrowth, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Hey!" She risked a glance back and found 3 Green Army soldiers running after her. They were less used to the terrain than she was. She had walked this path 1,000,000 times over the past week, but they were gaining on her quick, their swords raised and ready. The shopkeeper kept running, but her knees were screaming, her lungs on the verge of collapse. She was so tired. So tired. A yell came from behind her. She tried to ignore it, until it came again. She glanced behind her once more, stopping dead in her tracks when she realized what was happening. One of the enemy soldiers was on the ground, a small dagger embedded into the nape of his neck. The other 2 were doubling back, facing the attacker that must have followed them up into the forest. She caught sight of brown hair, a small frame. Oh gods, he's alive! It was the boy who'd lied his way into the army, and had fought bravely in it until the very end. The shopkeeper glanced behind her, to the cave where her main objective was. She was so close. But the boy she saw was unarmed. The decision was already made. She ran back down the mountain, her axe in her hand. The soldiers had cornered the boy against a tree, their blades ready to cut his life at 17 years. But that meant that their backs were to her, and they never saw her coming. Just pretend you're chopping down a tree, the general had taught them. Wait. Oh, this is a flashback kind of thing. Just pretend you're chopping down a tree, the general had taught them during their training phase at the castle. The axe will get the job done, but it'll take a few swings. It only took her 2. One through the neck, the other into the skull. The 2 soldiers dropped dead at her feet. The boy stared up at her, breathing heavily, his face streaked with blood and dirt. It looked as if he'd aged 50 years in a day. The shopkeeper no longer recognized the young, foolhardy boy who'd run around camp doing the most menial chores, grinning from ear to ear, taking pride in being part of something bigger than himself. He was battered and bruised and bleeding. With eyes so haunted, the shopkeeper couldn't help but wonder about all the things he'd seen since the sun rose over the battlefield. "What has the world done to you?" she thought. But all she said was, "Are you all right?" The boy could only nod wordlessly. "You need to get out of here," she said hurriedly, already hearing more soldiers coming up the mountain. "Here, take this." She shoved her axe into his hands. The boy shook his head vigorously. "I can't," he croaked. "You need to protect yourself. You need to protect yourself." She gave him a bitter smile. "Trust me, kid. You need it more than I do. Now go. You know your orders. Back to the camp. Follow the sun." Before she could think better of it, she pulled the boy into her arms, hugging him tightly. For a moment, he could only stand in listless surprise, and then she felt his arms close around her. He buried his head into her shoulder and let out a single gut-wrenching sob. When the shopkeeper let go, there was a new spark in the boy's eyes. Faint, but better than nothing. "My computer is running low on storage space. Thank you, computer. Okay. Not now, I'm live." The boy turned to go, but lingered at the tree line. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nikki," she said. "My name is Nikki." "I'll see you later, Nikki," the boy said, and was gone. She stared after him for a while, her heart feeling lighter in ways she could not explain. Oh shit. It did refresh the time on my session. God damn it! This is gonna be 2 VODs. Are you fucking kidding me? Alright. But then a twig broke in the distance, heralding the arrival of enemy troops. The shop steeled herself one last time and headed for the cave. Inside, stacked from one end of the cave to another, connected to natural underground caverns that ran the length of the mountain, was the king's last resort. The only thing that stood between their kingdom and certain doom. We will see our enemies burning, the king had promised them on that first day, lifetimes ago. Is it TNT? Is it TNT? Or is it explosives? Because that is very Wilbur. It wasn't exactly burning, but blowing them to Kingdom Come was an acceptable compromise. I knew it. The flint was in her hand. All she could smell was sulfur and the distant scent of irises. Her pursuers were at the mouth of the cave, screaming as they realized what she was about to do. They might have begged. She would never know. "I'll see you all in hell," she said bitterly, and struck the flint into flame. At the summit of the opposite mountain, in a cave almost identical, the captain did the same. "For my kingdom," she whispered to the empty cave, and let the fire fall. Nikki hoped, at the very least, that they would plant the prettiest flowers over her grave. I saw that quote before. I knew it had to do with Passerine, and so I was like, oh god, Nikki probably dies, and I forgot Nikki was a part of this. Because I'd heard that line before. Oh my god. This was the context. I did a pretty damn good job of forgetting that line. I did it on purpose so I wouldn't be spoiled. The explosions rocked the world. It rattled the very sun from its loyal orbit. Wilbur braced himself against the rock he'd once stood fearlessly on, and watched the mountains fall. Yes, the voices chorused. This was always meant to be. Wilbur had been here before. He'd dreamt it. He'd lived it. As an avalanche of rocks and earth cascaded into the valley, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be left behind, friend or foe, Wilbur felt a tug of familiarity at his core. His ears rung from the violence of it all. The voices, the screaming, the blasts that went on and on and on. Flocks of birds soared up into the sky, disturbed from their perches. They were the only survivors. When the dust settled, all Wilbur could see was a pile of devastation where the Blue Valley used to be. Their enemies, crushed by the thousands or buried alive on Wilbur's orders. And their allies. Wilbur bent over the ground and vomited. Wilbur's ears were still ringing. He heaved the last of his stomach's contents, coughing up blood and spittle. There was no end to it. Wilbur turned, almost afraid of what he would find behind him. Tommy, his face pale, his eyes wide and staring, as if he had never seen Wilbur before. Tommy, Wilbur croaked. Stop looking at me like that. Look away. Look away. Look away. What? Tommy's voice was so small. What the fuck did you just do? What the fuck did he do? The war god demanded. He tried moving towards the king and the prince, but Techno was there, forever blocking his way. Don't take another step. Techno raised his trident, its prongs aimed towards the war god's chest. Your army is gone. There is nothing left to fight for. You bastard! The god growled, his obsidian sword trembling in his grip. You think this hurts me? I died years ago. Techno took a deep breath. His hands still reeked of sulfur. Come then, he said exhaustedly. Blood for the blood god. I shall kill you again. The war god jumped towards him, starting the cycle anew. You said no more secrets. Tommy's nails dug bloody crescents into his palm. You promised, Wilbur. They were all dead. They were all dead because of the man that Tommy couldn't bear to call his brother. He wanted to dig into his skin and rip out every part that was Wilbur's. He wanted to gut himself, tear it all apart from the inside out, if that was what it took to get rid of the screaming in his head. Wilbur wasn't meeting his eyes. Tommy marched up to him and grabbed him roughly by the collar. Fucking look at me, you piece of shit! Tommy screamed. The ground was still shaking. Or maybe it was just him. Hot tears spilled down his cheeks, tears of a rage too big for his body. How long have you been planning this? Was it from the beginning? Did you look our people in the eyes and never bothered telling them you were leading them to the slaughterhouse? Some of them have to have survived, Wilbur whispered, his words almost lost to the winds. I warned them. Tommy shook him violently. That's not the fucking point! He sobbed. Wilbur finally looked at him, but there was nothing behind his dark eyes. I did what I had to do, Tommy, was all he said. Tommy shoved him viciously away. His hands felt dirty. He felt unclean. In his head, he could still hear the strings of a lonely guitar playing over the soft laughter of soldiers that were now simply gone. Gone in a flash, between one breath and the next. It had come so easily to Wilbur. Would it come easily to Tommy, too? You fucked up. Tommy spat. You fucked up, Wilbur. Wilbur reached out for him, but Tommy flinched back. Don't fucking touch me! In battle, when two opponents were evenly matched, in strength, in wisdom, in anger, it would only take one thing to bring it all down. One soldier, one mistake, one move. The war god had seen his fair share of battles, and had won them all, except one. The only battle to matter, and he lost everything. Because a blood god had decided to throw his lot in with the opposing forces. One soldier. Afterwards, the war god had dragged himself through the battlefield, his throat burning from screaming his lover's name into the quiet sky. When he'd found him, the war god had crawled towards his broken body, curling as if he could somehow warm it back to life. Curling around it as if he could somehow warm it back to life. And he had stayed there for years, letting the moss and the weeds grow over the two of them. He would have stayed there forever, beside the carcass rotted down to the bones. But a fire had grown inside him, a fire that would not be satiated until he had the head of the god that had taken everything from him. Wait, hold on. I need to make... This doesn't make sense. What? Oh, this is describing the war god. Okay. His lover. Who is his lover? Now here he was, facing off against the very culprit. It was a bloody dance. The war god slashed and the blood god parried. The war god I already said that sentence. The blood god lunged and the war god ducked. Like the push and pull of the tides. At least I think, or am I dead wrong? Shut up, me. Oh my god. Drawn to each other by a gravity of violence. But all the war god needed, he knew, was a single chance. He would not waste it. Don't fucking touch me! The words were the high-pitched shriek of a frightened child. A familiar sound on a battlefield, indistinguishable from every scream that came before it. But the blood god turned towards it, leaving his defenses completely open. One mistake. The war god raised his sword high above his head. It was very difficult to kill a god, but not impossible. In the right hands, like the hands of a warrior with fire in his heart and carnage in his smile, it would only take one blow. Goodbye, blood god, he thought. My vengeance is complete. Technoblade turned instinctively at Tommy's scream, just in time to see Tommy draw back from Wilbur's reaching hands. Pain flashed across Wilbur's face, but he was otherwise unscathed. Both of them were safe. No knives in their backs, no arrows through their throat. A shadow fell over Technoblade, and by the time he remembered where he was, it was too late. Technoblade turned and faced the tip of a bloody sword, a breath away from his face. But it was not the war god's obsidian blade, coming to reap his soul. It was a familiar silver broadsword, pierced right through the war god's chest. Wait, what? Turned and faced the tip of a bloody sword. It was not the war god's obsidian blade coming to reap. A familiar silver Phil. Phil. That's his sword. Technoblade could only stare as War God looked down at the blade embedded straight through his heart, his sword arm still raised in what would have been a killing blow. Yo, he's back from his vacation! Yay! Thank you for saving Techno's life, but also, fuck you, Phil! Obviously, this is character Phil and Passerine. I'm not talking about actual Phil's, Instead, the obsidian sword fell harmlessly out of his limp hold and onto the dirt, and the war god followed close behind. Behind him stood a winged man, his golden hair catching the rays of the setting sun. No, the voices screamed. Not you! Not you!